Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
This is a presentation on concerns of organizing engineering business and systems, which is the second component of the first module on business engineering organizations and human resources management as the course topic. As of today, the workplace is greatly dependent on engineering principles and practices. In fact, it is my view that there are only two types of organizations which exist: engineering driven organizations and engineering determined organizations. This includes manufacturing and services. Therefore, it is important to appreciate the interaction between engineering and management and how their interaction affects business decisions. So, for the coming 3 hours or so, I will be drawing your attention to the nuances of interaction between engineering and management and how to move on from being an effective designer of systems, that is an engineer, or how from being a person who is operating a system to a person who puts that system to productive use, that is a manager. Traditionally, large firms have been the focus of engineering action, but it is now recognized that even small and medium sized enterprises are characterized by engineering business. So, engineering business is now becoming a competitive proposition, and like any element which becomes a competitive proposition is adopted by everyone and ultimately loses its sheen and gets its success or otherwise by the human elements which operate it. Let me restate that for the sake of clarity. The earlier stages of competitive proposition comes out of the technological factor and the engineering business, but subsequently all competitors get onto the same kind of platform of technology and engineering business, and the critical competitive proposition then comes out of human resources management and human element in it. However, the concentration is still in terms of focus on large organizations who find the resources for technological advancement. But then I want to emphasize a very simple proposition. Engineering business is common to all shapes and sizes of organizations, small, medium, large, and obviously the subcategories which exist there. A quick run through the factors affecting engineering business will help to bring clarity to the situation. Accumulated technological competencies. This is very important in the success of an organization, because ultimately engineering business succeeds from a whole spectrum of activities, from the R&D which is indigenous to the organization, to the field engineering which keeps the equipments which the organization markets going. and I would put this spectrum from R&D to field engineering as the factor of accumulated technological competence. Then there is the question of external orientation. After all, to make success of any engineering business, the machine acclimatization competencies of the user community is clearly an important variable. How good would be the effectiveness of an RO, a water purifier, if the filters were not regularly changed and if the maintenance of that critical but small equipment was not as per engineering specifications. Therefore, external orientation of engineering business is important, and for the success of engineering business, an awareness program on the niceties it takes to keep the system running on behalf of the user community is absolutely important. Then there is the question of organizational specialization. Engineering business requires within the system a specialization into the different kind of functions the equipment or the services has to undergo. Take for example, telecom. To make a success of telecom business, you need engineering business competencies in a whole set of subspecialization, beginning from the switching system to the transmission system, the maintenance of the towers, not to overlook the capacities and the capabilities of the instruments through which the transmission would be sent out or received. Therefore, organizational specializations in engineering systems are progressively acquiring the shape of super specializations, though they have not yet been accepted as such in institutions dealing with skill formation. The matter does not stop there as in a manner of speaking. For engineering business to flourish, where phasing out is such a common exercise and upscalability is such a fundamental characteristic people look for in buying engineering based gadgets, equipment, setups, services which draw their strength from engineering specialization, that unless there is a user familiarity with the basic commands of running a system, you will find that everything from digital television to a handset will run at a huge possibility of underutilization, and therefore, ultimately will risk losing of the market, because after a few years people would not be willing to pay for services which A, they do not use, or B, they are not comfortable using, or C, they have no use of. So, there is such a thing as organizational specialization in engineering business. Then there is the concern of the internal strategy cohesion. Going back to the telecom example, if you are dealing with switches and you are dealing with transmission towers and you are dealing with equipment or handsets, there has to be a strategic cohesion. and I am not quite sure whether this has been recognized and integrated in skill formation for engineering systems. And finally, there is the question of management skills. The kind of management skills which are needed in running of engineering business are not the same as those which are needed in running of say trading activity or tourist activity or stock exchanges. Therefore, this listing of 5 dimensions of factors affecting engineering business is going to be the touchstone of much that I am going to elaborate in terms of scope of engineering business. The choices about the scope of engineering business range from broad front versus specialized operations. I will repeat that for you. The choices about the scope of engineering business range from broad front versus specialized operations, products versus processes, and the leader versus the followership. The innovative opportunities open to a firm are strongly conditioned by a firm's size and its core business. Therefore, talking of innovation is not enough. Innovation is embedded in certain material conditions, and it can range as far widely from firm size to the core business. The key strategic task in engineering business is to find and maintain a stable product niche and benefit systematically from user experience. Here again, user feedback has to be far more effective and sensitive than it is in very many businesses. I present to you a matrix which is adapted from Keith Pavitt on what we know about the strategic management of technology, which I consider a semi-classic, which has held the test of time for over 2.5 decades. And as you can see from the projection on the screen, on the y axis you have got the source of technology, the trajectory, typical product groups, and strategic problems for management. On the x axis you have the basis of differentiation, science based, scale intensive, informative or intensive, specialized suppliers. Now, I believe these blocks are self explanatory, and I will leave a little time for you to go through it and see the interrelationships, and then I will build upon it. The matrix, to my mind, demonstrates the range of possibilities which exist in engineering business and how it is important to position your organization and your investments carefully to get the best out of it. In the ultimate analysis, the supply chain management also becomes important, because it is the specialized supplier which will determine to a very large extent the nature of the market swing. I would like to draw your attention then to the emerging engineering business model which could arise, because business is fundamentally concerned with creating value and capturing returns from that value. Now, this is a point which I believe is very often missed. It is missed because business is seen as one of the routes for making profits. Now, no one can quarrel with that, but profits in business come through a particular delivery mechanism, and profits in engineering business comes out of a very, very specialized method of action. and in engineering business it requires creating value, and then alone you can capture returns from that value. In other words, continuous product improvement is at the core of promoting engineering business. Business model therefore, like anywhere else in engineering business, is simply a representation of reality. I have already elaborated with you the external realities which determine the context of business, and tried to show to you how even in a given sector there are subdivisions of specialization which have to be internally consistent. A properly crafted business model helps articulate and make explicit key assumptions about cause and effect relationships and the internal consistency of strategic choices. I would wish you to internalize both these elements if you are trying to understand what engineering business model is all about. There is always a cause and effect relationship amongst the various segments, and if there is a cause and effect relationship in the internal segments, then the internal consistency of strategic choices is important. The kind of choices exercised in the design of switching systems cannot be very different from the kind of strategic choices which are exercised in receiving towers, which can't be very different from the kind of strategic choices which are exercised in the making of the handsets. Therefore, understanding the nature of the engineering business across the various elements is essential to making a success of the overall business model. Which brings me to my final submission. The term creating and capturing the value reflects two fundamental functions that all organizations must perform to remain viable over an extended period of time. What are the two functions? Creating and capturing the value. The word value here is a utilitarian concept which has to be converted into engineering terms. Successful firm creates substantial value by doing things in a way that differentiate them from the competition. In other words, the jet propulsion principles may be common, but the way an Ilyushin flies is very different from the way a Boeing flies. And the principle of aviation as interpreted by the two streams will do what it did to their businesses, because firms might develop core competencies, capabilities and positional advantage that are different from those of competitors. Therefore, there is a strange contradiction there. You can only compete when you are unique or when you are different. You can't compete by competition of imitation, or you can't compete by rules which are drafted by your competitors. Neither value creation nor value capture occurs in a vacuum. Therefore, engineering business requires breathing of technological life into the engineering action. And I believe this is the right stage in the discussion to urge for a clarity amongst words which are used very often in a manner which causes confusion, and indeed something which creates a proposition where you believe that to be different you have to outdo. Which brings me to a submission which I consider important in this context. Value creation and value capture occurs within a value network. When I am talking of a value creation, I am talking of a product which creates value for the customer. Value capture is used in a sense in which the return from that kind of equipment is critical to the business advantage, but above all it has to be done in a value network, which will help to underscore the difference which I was wanting to register, and I had to go into a slight deviation to embed it. That is the differentiation between technology, engineering and equipment. They are not all synonymous. Management of technology therefore does not become management of engineering business, and management of engineering business does not become managing equipments. We are here focused on business which comes out of the engineering activity. It is another matter that all engineering business will have a backward linkage to technology development and a forward linkage to equipment distribution and maintenance. Therefore, this would include suppliers, partners, distribution channels and coalitions that extend the company's own resources, and this is critical to engineering business. And in the light of what I have just elaborated, please notice the players include suppliers, partners, distribution channels and coalitions that extend beyond the company's resources, and that is what makes engineering business tick. This is where just understanding general management is not good enough, but it has to be put in the framework of engineering business. The engineering business firm may be able to create unique relationships with any of these parties or even with its end customers. In fact, it is my case, if I go back to the slide, the way the firm links up with suppliers, partners, distribution channels, coalitions, singly, or to coin a phrase, a word, doubly, or in a multiple manner, or in a holistic manner, to take all of them together, will create the business propositions on which it will flourish, which is why I am saying the engineering business firm may be able to create unique relationships with any of these parties or even with its own end customers, which is what then leads to brand loyalty. And of course, this has been converted into engineering business. What is messaging from equipments of the same from one to another? I do not want to name these messaging devices which operate free of charge, devised by companies with equipment which two parties may hold, but which have the same underpinning technology. Anyone who deals with telecom knows what I am talking about. But this business of creating engineering models which talk to each other is meant to promote a loyalty which has operational meaning, and this is where again engineering business acquires a strange connotation. The role a firm chooses to play within the value network is an important element in its business model. For example, an engineering based business firm may focus on the development of a competitive supply chain. I would like to draw your attention again to the components of a business model, which is from Scott M. Shafera and H. Zeph Smither and Jane C. Linder, a comparatively recent one, and it shows in a summary form what is called the power of the business model. The components of the business model are shown as strategic choices, value network, create value, capture value. So, in other words, it sums up what I have been trying to explain to you, and I am going to leave it on your screen for a while, so that you may try to absorb it. Basically, it is summing up of what I have already explained, therefore, there is nothing really to add. The strategic choices touched upon customer, value proposition, capabilities, revenue, competitors, output, strategy, branding, differentiation, mission. Value network talked of suppliers, customer information, customer relationship information flows, product, services. Creating value would be resources and assets, processes and activities. Capture value would be costs, financial aspects, and obviously the profits. The key focus area of engineering business therefore becomes generating information on timely fashion using IT tools. Now, generating information on time is more easily said than done, because the software which you need for generating and disseminating information requires a careful market observation mechanism, a careful market watch on what is available, a sensitive evaluation of the products which are in the market, a careful selection in terms of their maintenance and upscalability, and a very proactive phasing out, not when the promoter company decides to phase it out, but when your requirements have phased out that equipment. I would also suggest the need to have an internal R&D, so that these products can be internally adapted for use, because there is no such thing as a perfect product for one's own use. One buys an approximation and then develops it, adapts it, modifies it to one's usage, and that is the good way of running engineering business. If you use the web based software communication to be updated with the customers, in many cases it works, and one should not rule that out. Continuous receiving information, updates and feedbacks to strengthen the supply chain would be an obvious choice. But using technology to collaborate with key stakeholders such as vendors is just as important as technological innovation on the product or high degree of sensitization of field engineers, or your ability to service, repair and respond with alacrity to a customer need. All these are essential components of engineering business. What then are the key managerial issues in engineering business? As you notice, I am conveying through the screen the need for a proper understanding of managerial plans and actions. For example, there is a strong need to understand organization structure, because work flows through the organization structure, and we will have a separate input on organization structure even in this module, which means that a conscious and sensitive intervention on the part of the manager for channelizing activities and handling processes is the key to handling engineering business proactively. Structures should not be taken as permanent entities, but need to be adapted to the business needs. Therefore, the recognition that all structural designs are by definition temporary and need to be hugely responsive to the demands which are made on them, and not preempt a good business decision because the structure has not been enabled to handle it. In organization after organization, I have noticed that systems and processes become so oppressive that at times good business deals fall through, because internally somebody knocks it down as not acceptable because it has not been incorporated into organizational functioning. And it seems to me that is the last argument in business relationship to accept, and yet we all know that this can be very true. This applies indeed not just to engineering business, but this applies even to mega organizational firms when it comes to their recruitment, their compensation packages, the kind of flexibility some individuals may need, but the system does not take it in, because nobody knows what is the exception to be made, where it is to be made, and where the exception has to be stopped to say this is not a precedence to be quoted. In other words, if you want a good engineering business, if I might say so, you would need a structure which is capable of being sensitive to business requirements. From a visible vertical structure to a more horizontal or networked model is an old argument. You have heard that before, but that does not prevent it from being valid still. Greater integration amongst and within organizations again is essential, because there should be not only an interactory relationship, but an opportunity to influence each other, and if not influence each other, at least tell each other what your requirements are, because it is only then and then that the other components of the organization can be expected to possibly respond to what your requirements are. The strategic planning process needs to be of help to define organization culture. That does not need too much of an elaboration. The manager of an engineering business should also have an understanding of changing global engineering business environment, which as of now is characterized by innovation of products and business processes, emergence of multiple stakeholders for business enterprises, cultural influence on engineering practices, knowledge integration. Now, why do I emphasize here the need for understanding and changing global engineering business? Because engineering business is really rooted in creation of standards, and creation of standards is rooted in compatibility of equipment. The need to have patterns which are serviceable beyond linguistic barriers, because engineering has to have as its element of compatibility. Of course, depending upon the type of the product, the scale of compatibility can be limited or large. But if you come to say, again to go back to a highly useful example in this kind of discussion, if you go back to telecom, you needed an international telecom union, because you can't run the telecom business without cross border handling of technology. That, however, may not be a situation when handling water pumps, which is why right at the beginning I talked to you about engineering business in the small firm area, in the medium firm area, in the large firm area, but a need to have awareness of the changing global patterns in engineering business is a must, because this can lead to local innovation, it can lead to cost cutting, it can lead to optimization on materials, and above all it can give messages for direction of the forecasting of skill needs, and therefore, the kind of skill formation that needs to be encouraged in engineering institutions. So, to give a quick recap, innovation of products and business processes is a must. Emergence of multiple stakeholders requires the business enterprise to be responsive, because earlier on the environmental stakeholder was not as articulate as they were today. The policy complexities were not as large as they are today. The kind of turbulence which one notices in the business environment, the kind of currency fluctuations which are taking place were unheard of 15 years ago. So, it is quite obvious that there is an emergence of multiple stakeholders, and no stakeholders can be ignored unless they are ignored at one's own peril. As the world goes more global, the local influences on global patterns have become larger, which is why I have said here in this slide, cultural influences on engineering practices have to be understood, and this is an area which at the moment has not been receiving as much attention as, to my mind, it is important. While talking of the cultural influences on engineering practices, obviously one has to look at knowledge integration. But none of this is likely to happen unless the issues related with technology transfer could be critical, and issues of technology transfer are as tricky as international relations. And I have seen studies which have established how the same technology was sold multiple times to different clients within the boundaries of the same sovereign state, because the clients themselves did not know what the other client has purchased or the price at which they had purchased, and anyhow exclusivity of technology transfer falls when it is sold to multiple clients who are in a competitive mode in the same domain. So, there are tricky areas of business which need to be accounted for, which need to be understood if engineering business is to have practical orientation, and it is obvious that many engineers are not aware of these kind of fluctuations which can and do take place, and if there are people who understand the commercial transactions and no such fluctuations can take place, are not in a position to influence the engineering practices. So, it seems to me that there is an obvious need of creating a dialogue, and the dialogue would come through creating skill formation through management of engineering business. There are other ways of creating this dialogue, but this certainly is an important way. The role of top management in engineering business. The top management of engineering business should lead to infrastructure development for technology transfer. This, to my mind, is a must. It is only then that you will be able to develop a business environment. If you have created the infrastructure development for development of technology transfer, it will lead to technology flow, and this I consider important to register. Technology transfer is never a one stage phenomena. In fact, technology transfer has no meaning unless continuous upscalability is an essential part of the transfer. Similarly, developing business environment would be essential to make sure the infrastructure developed is sustainable. How do you create a business environment which is supportive to this? By a sustained, comprehensive awareness campaign, which I believe should be developed as a specialization in management of engineering business. What is the specialization I am talking about? I am talking about creating in all stakeholders an awareness of what it takes to run engineering business successfully. Technology transfer, however, does not stop with technology being moved from one point to another. Technology transfer can be complete only when the human elements have absorbed that technology, and that takes a lot of time. If you want me to make an illustration, just consider how many otherwise perfectly competent gadgets of television use a recording device to record a program while they are watching another, and how often they go back to replaying it, and what is the incidence of the usage of this technology and engineering business option by the user even when it is available. Developing competitive cost structures will inevitably become a factor of this, and that will have a downward spiral if the facilities which arise out of engineering business are not being used. This leads me to a very important proposition, which I will partly discuss in this session and will come back to later on, when I want to focus attention on how engineering business will require a strategy. But before we talk of engineering business as a strategy, you would do well to appreciate that engineering business can be defined as the set of strategic decisions and actions required by managers to transform engineering input into output, with the objective of achieving competitive advantage. Let me read this out to you, because I think it is an important line of thought. The engineering business strategy can be defined as the set of strategic decisions and actions required by managers to transform engineering inputs into outputs, with the objective of achieving competitive advantage. Each engineering business activity, therefore, requires a concomitant strategy. The technology is a driving force in engineering business. Remember the distinction which I drew between technology, engineering and equipment, which helps determine the strategic future of the firm. The key issues in engineering business strategies are linking technology transfer and cultivation of indigenous capabilities. I am building upon the sensitization and the absorption factor as elaborated earlier to cover now indigenous capabilities. Organizational effectiveness issues in the context of the use of technology, machine maintenance, acclimatization, upgradation, upscalability, weather proneness, or if I might use a word which lost its sheen some decades ago, but I think remains valid even today, monsoonized. It is not just space temperature control, but prevention of the corrosive influences of moisture on equipment. Context of the use of technology, influence of external factors on the outcome of engineering business, and government's policies and regulations. All these together create a framework for engineering business, which will have to be interpreted in the context of the firm, in the context of the industry, in the context of the actual products which you have at hand, because technology is the strategic asset in any engineering based business. And how do you create a strategic choice around a technology assessment and evaluation, which will lead to an enhancement of engineering business, is the question which will be the seed bed for a lot of business successes or a lot of business disasters. The manager makes strategic choices amongst engineering alternatives. Yes, that needs repetition. The manager will have to make strategic choices amongst engineering alternatives, and for that engineering strategy would be vital to firms. The engineering business strategy evolves with engineering technologies, which in turn have close linkage with engineering business. So, to sum up, therefore, I am drawing your attention to a linkage between engineering business strategy with engineering technologies, with engineering business, and if the three can be put in a comfortable relationship with each other, I think the act is on.